Some of our dearest experiences with games have to do with characters, storylines, and worlds behind them. But how are they born, and who are the creators behind these experiences? Today, we have a great honor to hear words from a senior narrative designer behind Remedy's acclaimed Control. Please welcome to the stage, Brooke Maggs.
Hi everyone, thank you. Okay, thank you very much to Alto and for having me be part of your lecture series. It's a pleasure. So today I wanted to talk on basically just reflecting on what I have learned about narrative design so far, using two examples, The Gardens Between and Control, mainly because they're vastly different games, and we can talk a little bit about what narrative design looked like on each one. And I want to make sure that I leave enough time for you to ask questions as well, so if I skip over anything or you want to know more, please let me know. Even throughout, if something jumps out, that's okay, or we can sort of tackle it all at the end. But I'm going to talk about my path into games and how I got into game development, because everyone gets into game development in different ways, I've found. People end up in the industry from other industries or have interesting stories at least. So I'm going to start there because this might be interesting for you too if you're looking to get into games or are in games already. And so I'm going to use, like I said, two examples, and then I'm going to talk about the challenges of narrative design and lessons that I've learned overall. So a little bit about me. So my name is Brooke Maggs and I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I relocated to Finland a year and a half ago to work at Remedy, and Control was my first AAA game that I got to work on as a result of that move. So I've been telling stories for a long time with games. I don't know if anyone remembers Mario Paint with Mouse on the Super Nintendo. Might be showing my age slightly here, but in that game, it basically let you do whatever you like. It was sort of a little bit of a Super Nintendo Photoshop in a way, and I made sprites, I made little characters, and then used the stamp tool to tell my sister stories of all these characters that I had been making. And I would do it live because she would be sitting next to me. And so I'd be like, then this character comes and does this, and made little effects, sprites for them as well. And I think from there it went into other games and telling stories with them, but it was also one of my favourite ways to receive story because I could interact with them and play with them. Who here loves games for the story? I'm guessing many of you do because you are here. Yes, excellent. Some favourite story games? Anyone? Doesn't have to be the best one, just at the top of your mind. What do you really like? Life is Strange. That's a great one. Yes. Kentucky Route Zero. Yes. Brothers Tale of Two Sons. Great narrative design in that one, actually. Yes. Awesome. Okay, so it's good to get some game references too, just to get an idea of what you like. So one of my favourite games quite a while ago, and still was BioShock. And I went to a games conference in Melbourne, Australia, where they had the games writers from BioShock, at least one or two of them. So I went to their talk. I did not work in games at this time, but I knew that I wanted to get into it. And I was a little bit determined, so I waited around for a long time after the talk and went and spoke to him. And I said, this is amazing. Like, this is what I want to do. How do I do what you do? And he said, well, you need to do a lot of writing. Just do a lot of writing. And I was like, just do a lot of writing? Like, what does that mean? And basically what he meant was understand the craft of writing and storytelling. And at the time I was studying a Bachelor of Multimedia, which was this course that was like a mishmash of different things. It was business, computer science, engineering, and design. And the first 2 years were set, and then the second 2 years you could choose what you wanted to do. So as soon as I could choose, I was choosing writing subjects, not necessarily for games, but we were looking at interactive narrative and design subjects. And I blitzed those classes. I loved them. I thought they were great. My programming was perhaps not quite on point and knew that I wasn't going down that path, but having studied programming, that was very helpful and still is helpful to this day, because I can sort of have some sort of understanding or language around it, but I would not trust myself to program anything. After that, I studied writing and editing, and this was more of a practical trade kind of course, where we learned anything from screenwriting, short story writing, editing for magazine, writing for web, and that was perhaps also very useful for my foray into games that I would later draw upon. Little did I know that the things that I were doing were sort of going to benefit later on. I was sort of following what I found interesting and what I liked to do. And then after that, I got a job rather accidentally teaching at university when I went to find out more about their games course. And they said, well, while you're figuring out what you want to do, why don't you come and teach for us? Because, you know, I guess your grades are really good and we trust you. But they needed someone for their user experience design class for web. And so that's where I got a user experience background, or understanding in explaining and talking to students about how to design for people who, you know, are looking for certain pieces of information. So all of this stuff is kind of stacking up. And in that course, I started doing game studies. So we were doing wild things like applying feminism to Grand Theft Auto. And one of my friends was a lecturer there, and she actually recommended me to the voxel agents, and that is where my adventures in games began, because I said to her, would love to write for games. And she said, well, actually, there's this game studio looking for a writer. And that's where it began. So some of the games that I've worked on are largely due to my first project, which was The Gardens Between. And then after that, so I was working in a co-working space at the time where there were lots of game developers. And I would just, you know, be talking to people in the kitchen and saying, this is what I do, and I'm a writer, and I'm working with the voxel agents on their new project. And that led to two other projects, which was narrative design and some production work on Paperbark, which is, it's a beautiful Australian picture book story game about a wombat and the Australian bush. And it's very, very pleasant. So these are very pleasant, very relaxing games. And Florence, I consulted on Florence, which was sort of popping in 2 or 3 times to talk to the team about the story and how they were using mechanics to tell the story, and basically just giving some advice and letting them workshop the idea with me. And then, of course, control. But what I want to talk about first is The Gardens Between, because The Gardens Between is interesting because I thought that I would be coming on and writing for this. I thought I would be writing scripts. I thought I would be writing dialogue. I thought I would, you know, that's sort of what my understanding of story for games was at the time. But it turned out that this game was going to have no text or speech. And so I didn't really know how that was going to work, but I quickly found out. I have to say that this game completely changed my life because it introduced me to the idea of a narrative designer and what that is. But also at the time, I don't think the title narrative designer has been around for as long, so I think it's a relatively newish concept compared to some other disciplines in the industry. So I think around that time, and it's also actually completely different between studios. Sometimes there are different descriptions or ideas of what a narrative designer is, but we'll go into that a little bit more. But anyway, The Gardens Between is a surreal puzzle adventure game where you follow 2 best friends, Arena and Frent, as they fall into a mysterious world of beautiful gardens. And you, as the player, manipulate time to solve puzzles, so you don't actually control the player, the characters rather. So that brought around some interesting discussions as well. But first I will show you the trailer just to give you an idea for the game. People have seen this twice already, but for those following along at home, I will play it again. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay, can I full screen this perhaps? Cool. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the game to start with. So, starting with the Gardens Between, we had to decide what story we wanted to tell, and this took a while. We did a lot of exploration, myself doing a lot of writing to explore. I think even at some point I wrote some poetry. It was not great poetry, but it was still something that happened. We eventually, I remember there was this meeting that we were having, the 4 or 5 of us, Henrik, Jonathan, myself, and Josh was there as well. Anyway, they were pretty much the whole team. We were talking about our childhood friends, and some of us were still in touch with them, and some of us were not. But we all came to the conclusion that they had been pretty important to us, and we all remembered them very clearly. These people in our lives who are no longer in our lives, but had somehow really made a difference to them or changed them in some way. And there was something to that resonated with the whole team that we wanted to get across in this game. But that's kind of a complex idea. So how do we get that across in a game where we're not putting words in the characters' mouths, they're not telling us how they're feeling, they're moving in the environment, and we're moving time in order to move them. So one of the key questions was, how are we going to tell this story? And what we had to tell the story very much kind of governed the kind of story that we would tell. So what I mean by that, and I'll show you in a minute, was vastly more complex than what is actually made it into the game, because we didn't necessarily have the tools to tell a more complex story. And sometimes that's okay. You can tell a simple story and still have something resonate. So the proof for that in the pudding was, at this time, Journey had come out while we were developing the Gardens Between, or not long before, and Monument Valley had come out, if anyone remembers those games. Very beautiful games that told story with music and with colour and with imagery and with gameplay, the way that you moved through the spaces. So we knew that that was the theme and tone that we wanted to hit. We knew that was the kind of game we wanted to make. And our game director, Henrik, was very clear that he wanted this game to not be stressful. It was calm and meditative. You can't die. You don't score points. There's nothing pushing you along. Time stays still unless you move the controller. And at the time, I think it was a little bit of a statement about what games could be. There are now, more games I've noticed moving towards this, not kind of stressful, twitchy gameplay, things that are just very calm and let you explore. And I mean, I really appreciate that. So we had to use the environment and the art direction and the gameplay to tell stories. So what story is inherent in moving time to observe things in the environment in order to move forward, and what environments could we have that would make sense and help tell this story? So first I'm going to speak to developing the story. So I did do a lot of writing, but it didn't make it into the game. So writing for me personally is a way of thinking. So I, very early on, it was a very sweeping kind of fantasy story, because at the time Jonathan was doing concept art, our art director, that was had these two characters in it. That was sort of his take, and one of them had a sword, and then there were these big strange monuments in the background. And so there was sort of a fantasy but calm, eerie, I guess, vibe. So I picked up on that and did some writing. So at the top, I've provided a quick summary, which was very thoughtful of me, because one thing you'll note if you're writing people, that a lot of people who are not writing people don't like to read. So unless you're in the writing department will love this. But then other people will be like, why have you given me a 10-page document to read? Having said that, though, it's important for us to do that narrative work. And I had written, what the story could be, a synopsis. These were some early character designs, very early character designs for our two characters, Arena and Frent. Their names didn't change, but we sort of had this idea that maybe something had happened to Frent's arm, and he used this device on his arm to interact with puzzles in the environment. But we found it too hard to tell the story about what had happened to his arm, so that quickly sort of went away and became something else which Frent can control. He can interact with certain puzzle elements, and Arena can interact with other ones. Arena has a heroic cape. That was dialed back because we brought it more into the modern day. But in the game currently, she has a jacket that she really loves. She always wears her jacket, and there is actually a level in the game where her jacket goes missing. And you can see it down a drain, and the two characters go down the drain to try and get her jacket back, and Frent comforts her when she's really upset about it. And then another thing here, which I think speaks to some questions that were sent in about marrying player goals with character goals and character motivation with player motivation. So I'd sort of created just a grid to figure out, because that was something our game director was talking about. He was saying, but how do we make sure that the players' motivations are the same as the characters? And we quickly worked out that they didn't have to be, because how do you show characters with motivation if they're not actually pushing forward in the environment? You're moving time, they're technically just standing still. So as you start to unpack this, it gets a bit complicated. And we actually realized that that's why a hero's journey structure didn't work, because a hero's journey is about a hero pushing forward or being pushed forward. And there are other story structures that we can use that don't require a character to push forward. So I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But again, any writing people might identify with when your writing folder starts to look like this. Story draft 1, story draft 2, story draft 3, story draft final 2. And then it gets, when am I going to be finished? But it takes a long time. And the reason I show this is because I don't think people realize how much writing can go through, or something in the game design will change and you're like, all right, looks like I'm writing a new story treatment. So it's iterative and it takes time. And this is before, things got in engine. In fact, we prototyped some of these, those beautiful terrarium-like islands using Lego. And we tried to see how you could tell story in the space before we actually put it in engine. It was a lot of trying to work out how that worked. So once we'd done a lot of brainstorming and a lot of talking and a lot of meetings and a lot of discussion about what this game should be about, we came up with these things, which is, as I explained before, calm, you can't die, it's considered, it respects your time, it doesn't push you forward, And this is about friendship, growing up, and memory. And the point of view, someone asked about point of view, I think, which I'm happy to delve in later if there are more questions. But like I said before, the point of view is the player is observing these environments and trying to figure out this friendship, the story of this friendship, and the environments tell the story of that. And by the time you've observed all of these memories, you get to the end of the game and have this full understanding of key events in their friendship. And there's a reason why you need to value that friendship at the end. And I won't tell you the end. So when I was talking about an important note about the plot, we came across this voyage and return plot structure, which is in Christopher Booker's book, The 7 Basic Plots. And this one is a little bit more like Alice in Wonderland or Coraline, where the main character has problems in the real world, they run away, they fall into a strange magical fantasy land, then they sort of work through their problems metaphorically in that space, but the space quickly is first of all fascinating and beautiful, and then it becomes frustrating and tricky, and then they absolutely have to get out. So the Wizard of Oz is very much, she arrives there, it's beautiful, everyone's singing, we quickly realise there are some problems, she falls asleep in the poppy field, things are going wrong, and then at the end, of course, she fights the Wicked Witch. Even the old film goes through these colour gradients that tells this story, and similar to what we used for the Gardens Between. And then at the end, the main character falls out of the fantasy world and comes back to the modern world able to solve their problem or come to a new understanding. So that's how we felt that worked for us, because the characters in the fantasy land, they're not always pushing through with a clear goal. They're kind of wandering and bizarre things are happening to them, you know. So I think Alice in Wonderland is sort of the best example of that, and The Wizard of Oz. So we looked at those as well. And so in order to then use that story structure, we did these quick sketches. So this is Jonathan Swanson's imagery here, quick sketches of how the game could be put together. What's really interesting is this one here and this one here. We had this long discussion about how the characters could get from the modern, mundane, sort of super stressful world into the fantasy world, and we went, of course, a doorway. That's classic. But we didn't actually go for a doorway. But it's sort of a placeholder, and sometimes I think you need to just use placeholder cliche language when you're designing, and I think everyone in the team can just for the moment agree that it will be a thing which will act like a doorway and then move on. Sometimes I've been a part of discussions where like, no, we need to solve what that, you know, unique thing is, because we can't do a doorway, that's too cliche. But just accept that it's a doorway and then figure out the rest of the game and then go back and make it unique and make it original. That's just a quick side note of advice. So as you can see, we've used colour palettes here, Jonathan's colour palettes, to do the very 3 clear phases of Christopher Booker's plot, which is real world and the fall, and then in the middle, fascination, frustration and nightmare, and then the return at the end. This structure has pretty much stayed in the game, but this is still a lot more complex. So those circles up the top there, we had the characters separating originally, and then you could go play one garden with arena in it, one garden with friend in it, one garden with arena, and so on. And you know, the story might mirror or tell some sort of thing, and then they would come back together, be very happy they found each other again, and then get out. Again, would have been a great story, but it was too complicated for us to make. So that didn't happen, it got simplified again, and now they don't split up at all. Which is actually probably a good thing, because the other challenge that we had is why do we have two characters? And if we have two characters, they have to be as important as each other, because the friendship is important. And so Arena, her personality, she's very bold and always leads, is always out in front. She holds the lantern, which is a very important object in this game that gives light to the gardens, which I'll show you some more of soon. And Frent's more of a wanderer. He sort of stays back and looks at things and, you know, stops and smells the roses. And we had long discussions about not privileging one bold personality over one sort of exploratory personality, because we didn't want the game design to reflect that, which it would be very easy to do because it's easy to design for the character who wants to do things. But in the end, we gave Frent his own interaction, which is he's, like I said before, can interact with elements in the garden that focus like a bubble of time around objects that you can manipulate in isolation to the rest of the garden, whereas Arena carries the lantern and interacts with some other bells, which you will see soon. So it was literary plot structure that helped us solve how we can lay this game out end to end. But we still needed to understand exactly what we had to tell the story in the game. And that was something that I learned throughout the course of this, and I definitely made some rookie mistakes. So, for example, when I was writing a story for something that could happen in the game, Arena gets to the top of one of these gardens and she's holding the lantern, and then she slips and nearly falls, and Frent, you know, reaches out and grabs her hand and pulls her back, and it's this awesome, you know, heartfelt moment of, yeah. And I spoke to the animator and to the game director, and they're like, yeah, this is good. Like, you know, this has got something. But at the moment, with our budget, timeline, and bandwidth, we can probably lift an arm at the end. We could probably have them hug once in the whole game. And I was like, okay, so you want to dial it back a bit? Yeah, okay. Fortunately, we got some more money and some more people, so we could do a few more things after that. We were lucky enough to get some grants from some organisations back in Australia to get the game through. But that is something very tempting to do when you first join a game development team as a narrative person. You've got a very sweeping, clear cinematic in your head, and it's just not feasible. So we had to look at what we actually had to tell the game, and this required me to sit with our art director with a sketch pad between us, and we would just draw. Because I would say, okay, it would be nice if we can see that, you know, she's offended by something he says, or I don't know. And he's like, yeah, how do you show that? Because they can't talk to each other. So does she like turn away from him, or does he turn away from her? And like, is that too subtle? So we would have to kind of draw these actions or these interactions. And one of them is the placing of the light in the top, which I will show soon. So what we have to tell the story are man-made or modern-day objects to put in the environment here. Clearly, juxtaposition of beautiful green, you know, gardens and elements of things that are from our world that we recognise. Including this strange moving van in the background here. Okay, so, and a doorway. Cool. So we can put things in the environment to tell a story. We also came up with the idea or realised that we needed to have some sort of vignette or something like a story moment, we called them, at the end, where you can see these modern day objects are repeated or reflected. So, and then obviously that framing is very, very purposeful, where we've positioned the camera here to show you looking through this doorway to see these two characters. And then once you complete that level, you end up here and you see what the real world story moment is, which is, again, what we had to work together a lot to try and make obvious. So we would hope that elements in this scene convey that Arena's just moved in and Frent is stopping by to say hello. They're neighbours. And then the final thing that we have to tell the story, which was also integral to gameplay, is the world map, sort of, kind of. So it's this ocean of gardens. And this is the first garden. And then, these things are also kind of important too, which I'll explain in a minute. So this is the first garden. And then the reason why we wanted to do this is because you go into the gardens, but then we clearly needed a way to pull out and move on to the next garden. So we needed to show the player that there are more gardens. This is the game. You will progress. This is around how many levels there will be. This is what's coming up. And saving progress or going back and forward between levels. So that clear technical gameplay need and even user experience need needed contextualization in the narrative. And so we also joined these gardens to constellations in the sky. And that's essentially what this is. Once you complete each garden, they complete a constellation, and the constellation itself is the story moment. So I'll bring it all together now with an example of that, which I'm just going to have to jump here. Might skip forward just a little bit. Okay, so... Whoa, what's happened to their hair? That's crazy. This walkthrough is interesting because someone's changed their hair. That's very awesome. I would find a normal video, but it will take too long. But so anywho, this is the I've never seen that before. That's fantastic. Okay. That is super cute. Cool. Okay. So we have some modern day elements here, some things. So when you complete a garden, you get one of those, and then you complete another one, you get two, and then you get that vignette, which I'll race us through. So you'll solve some puzzles in the environment, and then that hair is just the best. Okay. Another couple of modern day objects that then well, so yes, that is fantastic. Okay, so it took us a while to work out that we probably needed those canned animations, and we storyboarded them to see how they would work, and then we did them in Engine to put them together. And then after that, it was a challenge to then find all of these modern day objects that would A, be good for puzzle design, and be good for puzzle design, I mean they're clear, they're readable, but they also play with time. So we have hoses that shoot water and the water goes back again, or we have like a Jenga tower that falls over and then you can put it back again, and dominoes and things like that. So we had to think about objects that are interesting to move with time, objects that you could put together to tell a story about these two characters, and also capture a story moment that's not too emotionally complicated, but what people could relate to. Challenge. But we did it. We had things like, just hanging out in the pool and, eating ice cream, and we had playing video games inside because it's raining, and we had visiting the museum together and just discovering things together as friends. So that was sort of the main thing I wanted to say about the Gardens Between, which was learning, I guess, that writing for me is a way of thinking, and then learning that narrative design can be a lot about structure and a lot about thinking about how these elements tie together to tell a particular story. So I arrived at this idea of narrative design, which is designing ways to communicate the story to the team, which is what that is up on the wall. It's like, here's the story structure, here's how that's going to work, because the team are the people who put it in the engine, so they need to understand exactly what they need to know in order to do their work. So what you saw there too, I guess, at the very beginning, all of my Google documents, is sort of the meta level of this is how I explain the story and how it works to myself. And then how do I distill it to explain it to the team? And then how do we distill it and put it into the game to communicate it to the player? So they can be 3 different levels and different styles of narrative design, depending personally on how you like to work as well, for the meta level in particular. So we also do, as narrative designers, keep track of the game world and the overarching story for the team, and document the game with other disciplines to describe. This is especially at Remedy, for example, the pacing of the story, of the dialogue, including where characters have emotional moments. But that was true of the Gardens Between too, because we wanted those key emotional moments in the nightmare phase, and where combat happens, and the journey characters embark on. So we didn't obviously put a lot of super emotional stuff up front in the Gardens Between, but we had that sort of trickle through over time. Okay. Right. So after my stint in indie development in Australia, I was lucky to receive a Women in Games Fellowship that gave me money in order to advance my career in games. So after working on these titles, I knew what I wanted to do and needed to do was learn how to work with dialogue and learn how to work with larger games and larger story worlds. And because I had done these games, so Paperbark also I worked with a writer, so I sort of helped bring her into the team and explain the bridge of communication, explain to her what she needed to know about the game and explain to the team what they needed to give her in order to write. For this one, or for these games, first of all, 2 of my favourite game studios, I just sent out many emails and sort of said, look, I have experience, but I want experience in these things. And I was very lucky that Double Fine and Remedy said, yes, come. And I spent 4 weeks in Finland on Control and 2 weeks in San Francisco on Psychonauts 2. And it was awesome. It was so great. And I was very lucky to have been offered a job by Remedy as a result. So I actually did the Remedy one first. They offered me a job. I kind of freaked out a little bit and said yes, and then flew home and did another narrative design job, went to San Francisco and did Double Fine on Psychonauts 2, which has an amazing amount of characters in this game. Like in 2 weeks, I was trying to get across like many different characters and how that was working. That was really interesting. And then packed up my life and then moved to Finland and started on Control. Whew. Okay, it was a busy year, but it was great. So who here is familiar with Control? Excellent. Okay, well, I was going to play you a trailer, but I mean, you seem to know, but I might play the trailer anyway because it's fun. It'll also give me a moment to collect my thoughts on this one, but we're going to dive into narrative design on Control now, but I will show you a trailer just to give you... Let's change tact from the Gardens Between to this.
Fair warning.
Gorgeous.
This is gonna be weirder than usual.
Everything's destructible. Excellent. Okay. So, completely different, but super interesting. Okay. So, this is where I really, okay, so let's start here. I came to Remedy and got to sit down in a room where Sam Lake pitched or talked to the narrative team, like gave a creative update on the world of Control. And it was a pleasure, and it was awesome, and because I didn't know what I would be working on when I arrived, just signing NDAs and then in because Control hadn't been announced. And the way that he spoke about the world and the characters and the story, it was great because it really set a mood. And I obviously hadn't played the game or seen much of it before that meeting. This was very at the start of when I did my artist residency. But I thought, yes, this is the game that I want to play. Like, it's modern day, we've got an active female protagonist, we've got supernatural strange things going on, it's a bit Lynchian, it's awesome. And I think one thing Remedy does really well is atmosphere and mood and tone and story and setting. And these things that you kind of have a bit of a sense for them before you dive in. And you know, when you see a piece of media like a film or a TV show and you're like, yes, that's my thing, it's talking to me. I think that if you can do that with a game before people have actually played it, it means that you've been, in my opinion, very clear about what your themes are and what your tone is and what your narrative is. People can kind of see this cohesive thing that you're putting forward. And I think that takes a lot of work. So for the Gardens Between, it was calm, meditative, friendship, memory, wholesome, probably not going to rip your heart out kind of, or maybe a little bit, vibes. And people kind of understand that experience, and then they look at Control and they're like, that's another kind of experience I want to have. Both are like totally viable, but narrative mood is something that that I think ties into, or that I've been thinking about ties into narrative design a lot, because it's not specifically the dialogue that you're writing or the actual text that we read in the game, but it's setting up how that text will be viewed, or thinking about how players are going to experience the story. So often I'm asked what the difference is between writing and narrative design, and so here's my attempt. I've heard a narrative designer, it was in a GDC talk, one that escapes me the title at the moment, but she described the difference as writing is the story from the character's perspective, and narrative design is the narrative as it is delivered to the player. So the narrative from the player perspective, so how we're receiving the story. So examples of work in writing are, of course, writing the scripts, writing guidance lines, which is if a character needs to say, I think I should look over there, or maybe the key is in that bottom drawer. So sort of helping the player through. Optional content, which we have a lot of in Control, anything from audio logs to video to documents in the world, and item descriptions. These are the realm of writers, though that's not to say, for example, we have some of our narrative designers at Remedy actually review the scripts and give feedback, or make comments or apply edits or things like that. So the two definitely go hand in hand. And I would say that you would be a stronger writer if you had narrative design skills, and you would definitely be a great narrative designer if you have writing skills. Both need very strong communication skills in terms of writing, but also I would even argue doing designs and writing documents and things like that. And that's a lot of my realm. So that's optional content design. So I might go to the UI designer and say, how much room do we have? How much text can we have on a page, and what does that look like, and how do we line it up? We also have pacing of the dialogue, or documenting any unique animations that we might need for a side mission, something that I did on Control, or thinking about what 2D art we need in the room. If we need a specific painting in the room for the story, I might follow that up. or how items are presented on the screen to the player, or how interacting with a document works. So if there's a document here, is there an interact button on it? And if so, if I walk over and I interact on it, what happens? Does it pop up and I can look at it, or does it go into my inventory? That's the kind of step-by-step thing that narrative designers may think about in collaboration with other people in the team. So, as I said before, I argue that both need storytelling skills and plot structure understanding and characterization and character arcs and so on, because we work as a team at Remedy and we all have different strengths when it comes to this stuff. But it could also be things like preparing for shoots and shoot prep for when actors come, making changes to the script on the fly, putting dialogue into our narrative design tool, all of that kind of stuff. So it can be technical. One of our narrative designers is more technical and she has the skills to go in and put the dialogue into the game, for example. And so as we work, we learn different things as we go, but also we have strengths and weaknesses, I suppose, as a team. So a little bit about my work on Control. When I came in, one of the first things I did, I sort of summoned some courage, and also just really driven by curiosity, went to each room and said, "Hello, I'm Brooke, I'm from Australia, I'm new. What do you do in this room?" Because I had literally worked in rooms where the whole development team was in one room and there was probably max 12 of us. So then I was going to Remedy, where there's a room of 5 or 6 people who all just do lighting, or who all just do environment art, or who all just do level design. I'm like, this is incredible. So one of the questions I then asked was, so how does narrative affect your job? What, is there anything you want to know about the story? And then people would just say, yeah, actually, I've been lighting this area and I'm kind of sure or know what it is, but I would like to know a little bit more about how it fits into the entire story. And I'm like, cool, okay, well, I will go find that out for you. And then, so I sort of just started doing this walking and being a walking world Bible, I suppose, which, by the way, I did have to study when I arrived, got into the World Bible of Control. It's got very specific world rules and things that we do and don't do to keep the narrative mood and tone. And so I read through that, and I read a lot of our inspirations that were recommended to me by the narrative team. And, so we developed our own shared inspirations. And then when I went and spoke to all of these people, one thing that came up was side missions and the Ocean View Motel and Casino. So these so I helped pace or helped work through some of the side missions. I'm not actually going to use those as an example today because there's quite a few that we could talk about. I'm going to focus on the motel and casino because it's quite a specific space, and I sort of think I can kind of condense my work enough to give you a bit of an insight into what I did here. So the Ocean View Motel and Casino, they're about 6 spaces in Control where Jessie goes in and solves a puzzle in order to get a key to open another door, and then she ends up in another area of the oldest house. And I was thinking, puzzles, transient spaces, I can do this. It's slightly similar to what I'd been working on-ish. But the point is that there was a mood and a pace for each of them. They were different. But they'd also been left in sort of placeholder mode because there were other important parts of the game that were being worked on at the time. And no one had sort of had their eye on these spaces for a while. So I suggested that I do that. So I'm going to give you a quick video of the motel so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, and then we're going to dig in a little bit. So it's another video, hoping that it works. Yes. Okay, so the key is actually over there on that desk, but it's on the ceiling. So we need to turn the room up the right way. Each press of the bell opens a different room, which is something you learn in the first motel. So there's nothing unusual about that room. And then in this one, there's a painting that's upside down. So if you turn the painting up the right way, the room is now up the right way, and you can get the key. Okay, and that's a motel sequence. So, one thing about these spaces is that they're a bit of a juxtaposition between the oldest house. You don't really see much of outside in the oldest house. The game is set inside a brutalist government building, and then the Ocean View Motel and Casino is very bright. You can see outside. It's obviously in a completely different location, but it still has an interesting tone to it. It still has a mood. So let me talk about narrative mood for a minute. Narrative mood is the glue or the invisible fibers that make up a cohesive piece. So I went and did some research on, literary techniques, narrative mood, and it is composed of the setting of a story, so this includes books as well, the tone and the themes. So the motel is a transient space that implies travel. Motels are, we don't really live in them, we sort of always come and go. It's a place that implies that you're moving on, you're going somewhere. The tone is, we had a ritual-like voiceover in there actually in the E3 demo. Originally, Jessie would say incantations as she was going into the motel, but we decided to remove that and instead have this place oddly empty. So the ritual is also not on Jessie herself, but it's the actions that she performs in the space. And the themes were ritual and dream logic. And this comes from a whole sort of backstory of history from when Sam Lake first wrote the script for the VTAR, which is a visual target for the game. And Jessie was performing a ritual which basically was rearranging mundane objects to change the layout of the oldest house for her to move forward. But then we, over the course of development, the idea of ritual opening the way forward was put into the motel, and building shifts and control points became something else. So that's a good example of how ideas can move and change. But it still is a way that we got ritual, dream logic, and repetition into the space, which is how we talk about power and control and how we talk about mysterious forces, let's say. So we don't say magic, mythology, and like the occult. Like those things are not really a part of this world because it's more of a new weird world. So instead we play with these ideas of ritual and dream logic, which also harkens back to our inspirations like Twin Peaks and X-Files and Annihilation, books like that. So how was I going to kick off the motel again? So this was an example of a finished motel, but this is not how they were when I picked them up. And so I went to Sam Lake and to our game director and to our world designer and sort of said, what is this space about? And absorbed that information and then put together a narrative design deck, I suppose. And what I did was I invited everyone from who were working on the motels, And I think this is an important thing to do, and it might seem like a rather obvious thing, but sometimes it's easy to work in a team and not talk to everyone in the team, especially when it's so big and people are stressed and, working and getting things done and fixing up their environment or getting their animations done. We don't necessarily always remember to sit together and play the game, but we're a lot better at that now. But, so what I did is also helpful for me because I didn't necessarily know everyone who was working on those things because I was still relatively new. So I invited them along to these meetings, and I also had some people who were working on the motels, in particular Jonas, who helped me put together some level design explanation, which I will show you in a minute. So collaborating with people who you are going to have a collaborative meeting with makes sense. It's also a good idea to do as a narrative designer because you're often relying on information from other people to figure out what you have to tell the story. And also, I would say, kind of selling them on the story as well, or getting them excited and involved in the story. I have also often called narrative design as being an advocate for the story. You're walking around and advocating for it and saying, no, this is important to the story, this is why. And writers will do the same thing, but often they're at their desk writing. So that's sort of something that I've noticed as well, just as an aside. So these are examples of the slides that I showed in this meeting. Some of this might have been rather obvious to the team already, but it was something that I wanted to just clarify. And in these motels, Jessie was using her abilities to solve puzzles so she can use the launch ability. And this launch ability feels amazing. You feel so powerful when you use it. But when you're using it to pick up like a coffee cup to move it across the room, it feels a bit OP, like it's a lot. So I recommended that we use interacts only, which is the X button or the square button, and you just sort of interact with things in the space. The motel rituals I proposed not be hard puzzles, they were quite complicated, so I suggested we sort of dial it back a little bit and worked with designers on what they could be like. Excuse me, I'm not a adept puzzle designer by any means, but they had to be simple and straightforward. And again, you're solving this, I guess, with no text or speech. You're solving a puzzle in a space, so it needed to be relatively obvious what you could do. So I thought, well, it would be good to sort of show how like the metaphor in the gameplay is working with the metaphor in the story. So I used some keywords and then stated again that every motel has a different flavour. So the one you saw has blood under the door and screaming. That's unique to that motel. And then other motels have different strange things going on. I did a quick environment overview. This is not necessarily for direction. These slides are very much just for like a starting point, a discussion. And obviously lead environment artists, and they have their own sort of documents and discussions about how they do this, but I proposed that we go for the dingy motel Americana vibe, which was something that Sam and Stuart and Mikhail were talking about for this particular space. So I guess what I'm saying is not all of this I could necessarily claim is my idea, but it was my idea to present it in this way, and basically jumping onto these motels meant that I was getting the vision from other people and then being the vision holder in and of myself. And so that's having to be very clear with people who have that idea, and then being very clear onward to carry that vision forward. So I was using concrete examples of what this could potentially look like. So then here's an example of one slide for the first motel, which is the hotline, which allows you to move forward in the space. So originally you get to a point and it just sort of drops off and the hotline is over there, and once you've solved the motel you can then go across. So so I included what the purpose of this motel is at the start, some script instructions. For example, for our writer, we might need to mention for the first time that there is a pyramid on the door that Jessie needs to note, because this is the first time you're in the motel, so she needs to go, there's that black pyramid on that door. Oh, I can't get into that door. probably need to solve that. And then, you know, hello, is anyone here? Sort of setting up, you know, this space. So we had that discussion and Clay wrote those lines. And then no extra audio art requirements. This one's as simple, you press the bell, you walk through, you pick up the key, you walk out. And then this is the level design take. I did not do this image, but it certainly helped the level designers have a more in-depth conversation, which is not necessarily something that I can have a conversation about, but I can book the meeting, get everyone into a room, put the pictures on the projector and say, talk. And then Jonas would discuss with the other level designers about how you know, they would implement this particular puzzle or other puzzles. This one I wanted to include because this is the one that describes the motel that you just saw, which is containment, which allows you to get forward to the panopticon. And this one in particular, we have blood decals under the door and screams coming from behind it. And it's the puzzle which I called Turn Me Up the Right Way. And this sort of is just the step-by-step of how that puzzle worked. So the good thing about doing something like this too is that if we have that meeting 1 week and then like 5 weeks go by and we're reviewing the motels, which I did as well, like play through them, we can say, oh, remember we were going to do this, and you can refer back to that documentation. So documentation is also definitely a part of a narrative designer's job. We document the game and the story and how it's going to be told. And then when people go, oh, like, did you want blood decals under the door? Do we still want to do that? Is that, and then I can go to my document and pick it up and go, yes, remember, like, let's talk about this. Do you want to change it? You know, we would really like the blood decals, it's creepy, you know, and then have that conversation. So I highly recommend that as well. Okay, so there sort of some examples of sort of what I did from then. That sort of provided a base, then we kicked off and then we reviewed the motels and then they got to what they are today. Just moving on, I guess, or zooming out more broadly to how narrative design might look. I sort of put 2 categories up here because I feel like I've been talking about 2 sort of separate, wider things. One is the actual stuff that comes out of narrative design, I guess. Sort of things in my job that I have done, like written a list of the props that we need in a space, an animation list, so what unique animations do we need for Jessie to do. For example, if she turns a painting up, it's funny what you will say, and people will go, oh no. So I said, well, so Jessie's going to turn a painting up the right way. And then animation comes and says, is she literally going to go like this and turn the painting up the right way? Or are you happy with an interact to turn the painting up the right way? And I'm like, well, I didn't think about that, but what's your bandwidth and your budget like? And we sort of talk about that, and they're like, look, given that Jessie only ever turns a painting up the right way once in the entire game, we would sort of rather you just do an interact. And I'm like, that's fine, that's fine. So yeah, that's interesting where you sort of pick your battles there, but also having a good knowledge of what affects or influences other people's work as well, I think is very important to know in the narrative department, because you may write something that you think is so fine or not even realise, and it has implications. One example actually was the furniture on the ceiling when it goes back to the floor. We were reviewing that motel, and all of a sudden I got a message from my friend in the sound designer for these spaces, and he said, so now the room's shaking and there's dust falling from the ceiling. I don't have time to make that sound. Like, how do we want the furniture to sound when it falls to the ground? And I'm like, it's not falling to the ground. What do you mean? Anyway, we jump in, we have a look, the room shakes, dust. And so we go chat to level designer and VFX artists, and they said, oh yeah, we thought it would be good for player feedback so that they know that the space has changed. Completely fine decision. Like, it makes sense. But we were saying, well, unfortunately, or for the narrative mood or tone of the space, the furniture isn't physically falling to the, and it's kind of mysteriously doing that. So, and it's so hard to then ask people to undo their work because it takes time, and in and of itself, it's not a bad decision. Like, it's a good one, but in terms of keeping that narrative tone, I felt so bad. I was like, can we just not have the room shake and not have the dust? And then sound designer was happy because he didn't have to figure out how to make furniture make a noise and what that sounds like in that space, especially because it's meant to be mysterious. And like, it's funny how that happens. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of challenge that just pops up. But so that sort of has to do with your audio asset requirements. The 2D art list, like the image at the end of each motel, needs to look exactly the same as what it is when Jessie arrives in the oldest house. And then, you know, creating a list of prompts and things that I might need from our writers. But then on the other side, I would argue, I guess, are the more less tangible skills, which are advocating for the narrative, like I said, setting the mood, stating a clear direction for the narrative or for the team, and being that reference point. And one thing I've learned, which you've seen examples of many times already, is using pictures. So you saw at the start I was writing a lot of words, but then figuring out how to put them in a visual way is super important. So just sort of aware of the time. My challenges in narrative design, I guess, have been the fact that the role can vary between studios and projects. Excuse me, it sort of depends who you have in your team. There can be varying levels of technical capability, and different studios have different storytelling tools. So you may arrive at a studio and not necessarily know that tool. So, you know, but you can learn. And then an understanding of what narrative design is or does. Like, for example, some narrative designers at some companies are also mission designers, and that speaks to a, you know, different kind of game again. So it depends on the game. But I like to say that narrative design, when it's done well, for example, Brothers, I think, is an excellent example, it's about playing the story. So it's metaphor, so it's the metaphor of the gameplay and how that speaks to the story, which means that it can also be invisible. So sometimes narrative design is that job where everyone's like, so what did you do on this game? And you can't necessarily point to anything in particular. And you might have even noticed when I was talking about the motel, I was talking about all the work many other people did on the motel. And it's hard to actually just put your finger on what narrative design is when it's being done relatively well, I hope. So another thing too is for those writers and narrative types is we have our own language that exists within how we talk about story. So this was something early on, I kept talking about conflict. This is for the Gardens Between, actually. I kept saying, you know, there needs to be conflict between these characters, or there needs to be conflict in the story between characters and the world. And the game designers are going, there's no fighting in this game. Like, there's no, it's not, you know, it's not combat. And I'm like, no, I know, like, but you don't have to fight to have conflict. And then, so I realized that I was using like a story, language around storytelling that I needed to perhaps step back and explain first. So sometimes you also need to say, no, what I mean about conflict is story is, like, where is the problem? What are we trying to say? Like, what is it about this friendship? Is it in danger? Like, why do we feel for it? So being aware of narrative jargon was something that caught me early on. And one thing that I have to say is that I believe storytelling is quite technical, and people don't necessarily understand that early on. And what that means is, you know, I mean, yes, you may have to design it relatively modular so that you can pull things out if you need to, but ultimately a story hangs together as a cohesive piece. And a lot of things need to be sort of authored and thought about in order to put that together. But just because you're not necessarily coding something concrete in the engine doesn't mean what you do isn't technical. When you're working in narrative in games in general, or you jump onto a project, I think it's very important to figure out if you're telling someone else's story or if you're coming up with the story. They're two different things. So who is the person that is the vision holder? Who says what the story is? Because story is, I don't know if you've noticed or have felt this yourself, but story is that thing that everyone gets very passionate about. Like it's the thing that draws people to it, or they're passionate about the characters and things. And in fact, it is sort of in everyone's work. It's in the environments and in the way characters move and in the cinematics and how they're shot and all of that. And so being clear about who signs off on what the story is very important. And then carrying out that vision of the story and being sure, or if it's your vision of the story, and if your job is to come up with the story, then be clear about that too. Okay, I think, yes, okay, great. So games as a storytelling medium, I believe, are developing, which means that we can hopefully think about new ways that we can interact and play the story. And I think that this has to do with thinking about what a narrative beat is in a game and then the presentation of that narrative beat in the game. So I guess, sorry, those two dot points kind of work together. But this goes back to the door example. We know at some point in the game, the character will need to go through a door, portal, thing, light switch, don't know, and then end up in another world. And it's important to sometimes speak in cliches and just sort of put up these little, okay, this is tentative, this is actually not what it is, and sorry it's a bit cliche and we've seen it in every other film, movie, TV, game before, but we just need to kind of hold that there for a moment and then think about why we need to, or how we're going to tell that in a unique way. So for example, we need these two characters to argue about something in this area. They need to disagree, they need to not like each other after this, and then carry on. And this is the same with writing a book too. You kind of know that there's a beat there or something that needs to happen. You don't know what it is, but there's a beat. And then there's the how you present that beat. So is it a fight? Do they shoot at each other? Do they have a disagreement over dinner? You know, what is the actual thing that you do? So be aware that there's differences between those things, that you can know that there's a beat, but not know how to solve the beat just yet. And I think part of good narrative design is always finding metaphor in gameplay, which I feel like I've spoken a lot about already, but if you're not sure, please ask me soon. And then advocating for the story. So being the person that's like, this is a great story, I'm going to tell it to you. Do you need to know answers? Let me find out for you and let me bring the story to you if you're not sure. Or point them out to where the documentation is or something like that. Okay, so very quickly, what I do now at the moment is narrative lead on Vanguard, which is a long-lasting service-based multiplayer game, where I have the opportunity to have a say in developing the world and what kind of stories will be in it and how we will interact with them. And I've been doing a lot of high-level designing of the creative vision, which is with our creative director, Stuart, and sort of helping capture the tone of the world. So I guess I'm now like helping craft that narrative mood and helping craft that vision and giving advice around, you know, how that could play out for the player, but also thinking about how that works from a writing and high-level story beats point of view, and thinking about how we can play the story and explore the world and discover the story. Which is super interesting. So I so far have not worked on exactly the same game twice, so let's see how this goes. And I think that's it. So these were some books. I thought I would pick out some things that you might like to read. If you want to get into video game storytelling, for example, Evan Skolnick's book does a quick overview of storytelling, sort of 101 in general, and then in the first half of the book, and then jumps into more games-related things. And then these other ones, for example, the one in the middle, I think, has a chapter on narrative design in and of itself. But you'll sort of notice that there are some like characterization and setting and gameplay and things like that. They're all written by different authors, and I have found them useful from time to time. And that's the end. Thank you very much. Okay. Cool. So now I'd absolutely love to hear what you have to say. What are your questions?
Hey, thank you, Brooke, for excellent presentation. And yeah, now we have some time for questions. So is there any questions in the audience here?
I'll just jump back to that. Okay. Yes.
I really like Remedy games. I find them very interesting from a narrative perspective.
Awesome.
Especially Control last year, very fun. But I always wonder with Remedy games, they always feel like that the narrative and the gameplay are not really mixing. Almost as if, especially in Control, for example, that they try, or that you tried to keep the narrative away from the gameplay. For example, you talked about the optional story objects that were lying around.
Right.
With, for example, the tape recordings, you had to stand next to them and listen to them. You had to stand in front of a video projector and watch the video.
Yeah.
In many other games, you can, walk away and keep playing the game.
True.
In a Remedy game, it seems like you have to stop to
enjoy that.
Is there a philosophy behind this? Is there a method behind this? I've been wondering this.
Well, I mean, so the interesting thing about Control is that it's a brand new IP. So we did a lot of world development, and in fact, we developed a lot of the world first, because the gameplay was going to be less linear and more Metroidvania style, opening up over time. Inside of this mysterious shifting building. So that, in order to, I guess, go along with the gameplay that requires, the unlocking, we considered then, yes, developing the world first, which I think was a good approach, because it was more about then, okay, who is the Bureau, what do they do, how do they study these entities? What are the entities? How does this happen? What are the procedures and rituals that they put in place in order to deal with these things? Because then what we could do is we have Jessie's story, who is an outsider, and so she can come in and sort of experience everything for the same time and have that mirror the player experience. And I would say that her story then is something that we can follow through, I guess at the start you sort of need to do that for the most part, and then the game opens up. But then you can choose to either pick up with that or go do some other things, like some side missions, and that's new for a Remedy game. And so that presented extra challenges for the narrative department, because then it was like, okay, so if you don't have to play mission 5 right now, but you can go do these other story missions, how do we make sure that you don't spoil something later on? So there was that added challenge. And that also meant that players could potentially start these side missions or experience these stories at different times, which was a challenge. And then we had to also think about, in a world that is destructive and you have powerful abilities and combat happening, how do we make sure that if you want to experience those optional content things, that they don't get thrown across the room, or they don't get destroyed or interrupted? And so we essentially tried our best to make sure that they were in areas, we worked a lot with level design, to make sure they were in areas that didn't interrupt. And that's also why a lot of them you collect and they sort of go to your menu. So you could sort of take a breather if you wanted to and read through some of them. And that, that's a viable way to play as well. So ultimately I would say a philosophy developed over time. Yeah.
Cool, Thank you very much.
No questions? Yes.
Hello, thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
I want to ask that how does your work relate into the actual texts and dialogue and other kind of copywriting in the game? Do you like oversee the process, or do you actually write yourselves something as well?
Me personally, I didn't write them, but what I did is I worked on how the UI interface would look. So I would talk to UI about the design, about what we could possibly do with a bureau letterhead, how big that would be, what that would look like, and then talk with our writer Clay about that kind of thing. And then, you know, he sort of very much took that then and wrote all those and had a lot of fun. So my writing doesn't make it into the game, but what I did do is I read through scripts and gave feedback and did things like that on side missions and main missions. So even though I'm not directly writing, I can still provide feedback to the writers, and in fact they all ask. They say, hey, like, here's a new version, you know, please give feedback, and then we go from there. Yeah, that's what I did there.
Okay, and we have one question from the stream. How is it like to work on living in Finland thus far? And was there anything that shocked you or surprised you in the game-making culture here?
Well, I really love living here. I mean, I have to say it was adapting to not having the sun and the beach for a while to live on. But I really like living here. Actually, the first time I had a white Christmas was last year, and that was the year before last year, 2018. It was amazing. It was so good. I've never experienced that. So we don't really have, obviously, white Christmases in Australia. So actually, the whole climate change has been interesting. And then also, I'm slowly learning Finnish, kind of, but that's trying to learn. And then I really enjoy, I mean, I've been to a few IGDA meetups, but so far everyone that I've met in the scene is super lovely. And there are actually, surprisingly, a lot of Australians in Finland and vice versa. So I think there's even a spiritual connection there that I'm, not sure about. But yeah, it's been good. It's been amazing. I want to stay, so.
Yeah. Cool. And how about the game-making culture in Finland? Is there been something different compared to your earlier experiences? Or?
I think so. Well, one thing about the culture in Australia is that it's very. We have a lot of indie studios because in the global financial crisis, a lot of large studios closed. So we don't have a lot of AAA studios there, but we do have a lot of mobile studios and game studios, small game studios there as well. So in ways it's similar because of the strong mobile scene, but also it's different because you have some, relatively big hitters like Remedy and Housemarque who are creating these larger style games. There's also, a lot of experience here as well, just I guess being closer to the rest of Europe with people who come over from Ubisoft and things like that, or whoever. So you never know who you're going to bump into. In Australia, I guess it's a little more isolated, although we do tend to be big travellers. So I would, just from what I noticed, there's also a lot of, there's in Victoria in particular where I'm from, there's a lot of programs designed to support games and support indie game development. I'm not sure if there's a lot of that here in Finland, actually. I haven't looked into it, but there's definitely a strong support from the government for games in particular there. So, I think that all those things make up different cultures, but that's probably not the best answer, but it's what I could do.
Yeah, thank you. And any audience questions?
Hi, Brooke. Thanks
Hello.
for the talk.
Thank you.
Really great. I'm really curious about your tools that you use in your work, and especially when you are telling stories and doing narrative design. It's often really hard to keep yourself in the right spot in the perspective? Like, are you too in the details, or are you
Yeah.
looking wide enough?
Yes.
So, do you have any special tools or structures or methods that you use to keep yourself on the track?
That's a good question. I mean, I've used everything from PowerPoint to Google Documents to Coggle is like a flowchart software that I've used before to try and flowchart an overall structure for the game. I try and look into, things that allow me to sort of digitize my thinking. They're probably the main ones. But then, like, as basic as it sounds, one of the things I did the other day was do some free writing around the themes and ideas in the game and how the gameplay looked and felt, and just sort of tried to connect them as I was writing. So more writing and thinking. And then I think that's about it in terms of tools. Sorry, that's not
Any tips for that topic?
any tips
For keeping zooming in and zooming out?
zooming. Yes. Well, I mean, divide it up in the day. Don't try and do it at the same time. Maybe have a day for doing zoomed out things and a day for doing zoomed in things. But sometimes, actually just recently, because we've been working on the world for this new game, sometimes to actually get a big picture description, we actually had to go really deep into the details. And then we had to kind of climb back out and go, okay, so what we're actually trying to say is 2 sentences. So sometimes it can be laborious, hard work, and you're probably wondering, do we even need to care about these details, really? Will the player ever care about them or see them? But it's more of a thinking process for you. So I would, I guess, encourage to, if you're struggling with the high level, dive into some details. And what that could look like is asking concrete questions about the story and the world. So why is the world the way that it is? Why do these characters do this gameplay all the time? Say, jump over walls and look for food. Why is food like this in the world? Where did food come from? You know, just like all these like world building, story overarching questions that may never be relevant in the game, but having answers for them is really helpful. So one thing you can do is, before you start diving into details, is ask yourself a bunch of questions and then set out answering them, for example. Yeah.
Okay, is there any more questions from the audience? Okay.
Hello.
Thanks. And thanks for you too.
Thank
for the
you.
Great presentation. Very interesting. I guess it's a simple question. Do you have any personal favorite tricks on grabbing player attention in games, from a narrative design or from a storytelling, writing perspective?
Oh. I kind of want to say, when you introduce a game mechanic or something for the first time, I like it to be, if I can have any say in it, it's also something new in the story, so that when you learn to do something new, you're also learning something new about the world or the story. And whatever that thing is, it should also perhaps speak to what's coming up in the story. So it's a little bit foreshadowing as well. So that's how I would prefer to do it. So in that way, the story beat or thing that you receive, I think Brothers does this relatively well actually, is actually part of pushing the story forward, or even taking a gameplay beat away or a mechanic away, that then speaks to maybe loss or something, rather obviously. But yeah, so I would prefer to, that's sort of my main go-to. I'm like, yeah, but what's this new gameplay element saying about the story? And then vice versa. What can the story say about the new gameplay element? Yeah.
Okay. Is there more questions? Well, I have some that our students have previously posted. And what have been your favorite moment in your career?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of my favourite moments have been on the floor, like showing the game, for example. I got to travel to Boston and Seattle to show the Gardens Between at PAX, for example, and then watching people play the game and enjoy it, and then sometimes like, oh, we need to fix that because no one's understanding that thing. It's really nice to get out of the studio and then see people enjoying the thing that you've been working on, because you've been so in it, you kind of don't see that overall it is rather enjoyable. It's very surprising sometimes to a game developer. The thing we're making is people like it. One particular example is at PAX, this little girl, 12 years old maybe, comes over, starts to play the Gardens Between, just fascinated, like just staring, like, and you know, really enjoying it, playing. Anyway, I'm like, oh, you know, and then she kind of left, and I'm like, oh, okay. And then she comes back with her younger sister, and she's like, right, I'm going to show you how to play this game, and then shows her, and she's like, and this is this girl, and she just started making up her own story about these two characters to her little sister, which was adorable. Like, and that kind of showed me it doesn't even matter if they know what the actual story is. They're just enjoying themselves. So that was really lovely. And then at Gamescom, when I had the pleasure to talk about Control, someone came up to me and had the same reaction that I had all those months, almost a year ago, when I had arrived on my artist residency and just gone, this game, it's my jam. And then this fan said, oh my gosh, Control is my thing, like it's my jam. And I'm like, I know, right? And I think what I'm saying is when the thing that you make makes it to the people that you make it for, it's super rewarding. Like, it's really nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we still have room for a couple of questions.
Ooh,
so
like 10 minutes to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you mentioned that like storytelling has become bigger in the games recently and so on. So how has it changed recently, and where is it going, in your opinion?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily be the one to hesitate to say, but I will try. I think some of the games that I've played lately, for example, I mean, not super lately, I guess now, time marches on, but God of War and Spider-Man and Hellblade and things like these games that sometimes aren't afraid, well, Hellblade in particular, to be a little bit smaller in order to tell a closer, more intimate story. I think we're getting to see that it's okay to make a short game that says something and then doesn't have to say anymore. Whereas, like, and then other games are sort of like, no, we need to keep you in, we need to keep you involved, you need to do all this work, and then here is some story, and please work for the story. But I also think, I mean, that's a viable game to make, but I think there's becoming more spaces with more platforms to, like itch.io and things like that, to just put something out there. I think that makes it easier for people who don't necessarily consider themselves game developers or career game developers to get together with some friends, make a game, put it online, and then just be like, oh, I've made a game, and move on. Kind of the same way people will just do a sketch or paint a painting or write a book, or, you know, they don't necessarily do it as a career, but just for enjoyment, like to make some art. And I think that's nice when game development starts to become accessible as a viable way to express yourself or to express an idea. And I think that has to do with you know, coding being more prevalent in classes and things like that, and that they're not sort of the realm of just the game development industry over there making games for us to play. Like, we can make our own. They can be text games, or they can be visual novels, or they can be anything like that. So I really like that games are becoming, like, people aren't scared of the idea of making a game. And especially, for example, like much younger kids, even just being exposed to Minecraft so early on, and, you know, this idea of just building your own thing. And I think that's lovely. In terms of where game storytelling is going, it's kind of it's kind of hard to say, but I would say I think there will always be a place for your single-player linear story experiences, but I would also hesitate to guess that games will start to be about worlds and many stories within that world, which excites me. I like the idea that you can wander through a world and there is some sort of through line, but that you could also affect the world and have it tell you the story as a result of what you do. I think that's interesting. So yeah, there are my thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone here has any more questions? Okay, then I could ask like this.
You've got some in your question bank.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have some that students have asked before.
Nice.
So,
Okay.
do you have any good advice, practices, or strategies how to become better in creating the game narrative?
Well, I mean, I think anything from creating the game narrative, I would look at, so one of the things I do as a freelancer is if I'm doing a narrative design job or sort of giving feedback or something like that, I will get the team to send me everything. I'm like, please send me as much as you can, like gameplay videos, a build, a design document, story document, what your characters like, what do you want the animation to be like, what's the art style like. So I guess what I'm saying is don't think that you have to just stay in the story area, like have a look at the game holistically. And then what I will do is go, okay, so your world is like this, your characters are like that, your gameplay is, you know, for example, about finding food and shelter. What does that say? Like, why are you encouraging the player to find food and shelter all the time? And why is the world the way that it is? Because narrative is the context for finding food and shelter. Like, narrative always offers, why am I doing this and why do I care as a player? So sometimes gameplay doesn't design as specifically. They might say something like, well, you go over here and you do these interactions and these elements and there'll be a puzzle, and they all design very like they say, and then because of gameplay reasons, you need to stay in this space for 30 seconds, and then the area will clear, and then you'll move on. Narrative. Why do you stay in one area for 30 seconds and then move on? And I'm like, I don't know. I'll think of something. So a lot of what we can do, because our discipline is so flexible, is we can say, well, you stay in the spot for 30 seconds because in this world, that's how long it takes flowers to grow. And, you know, you can kind of, and then, you know, the environment artist goes, we're not having any flowers. And you're like, okay, so in which case, and then you can go from there. So, well, guess what I'm saying is you think about, a tip is think about what the game is sort of inherently saying in and of itself. If there's no game yet, talk about that with the team and sort of say, okay, so what kind of story are we telling? What kind of game are we making? What's the emotional experience? Do we want players to feel on the edge of their seat and stressed? Do we want players to feel calm and reflective? Do we want players... So thinking about the emotional experience is one, thinking about the themes is another, thinking about how the player interacts with the world, because to me that's the most important thing, right? Because games are about interaction and play, so what about this game lets you interact with the world, and what about this game is fun? And are we even making a game where we have fun? Do we want to have fun in this game? Where is the fun? So then often what I will do is propose a structure or a way that pairs with the ramping game design, whether it's the puzzles are getting harder, the combat's getting harder, the flowers aren't growing anymore, food is getting scarce, any number of scenarios, and say, well, what does that say in sort of a story, you know, arc? What does that mean? And then I could sort of say, okay, so maybe there are different flower beds at different points in the narrative that you have to stand in, and each flower bed tells you something new about the world, or you collect a flower and take it to someone if we have like discovery in this world, and they tell you more about the flower, and the story's actually about all these flowers. You know, super quick example, but you get my point that it can sort of lead into everything. That's a very rambly answer, but I think that's sort of how I approach it. Then the other thing I might do is, if I want to talk about those narrative moments that are important and why they're important, I'll find references. So I'll go to, sometimes my favorite references might be Disney, or it might be, you know, any story where that's relatively clear on the emotional beat. So I might say, so in Moana, it's important that she, you know, loses faith in this whole, you know, go return the heart thing, and this is the story beat and how it happens. So do our characters in this story of flowers lose their faith in this, the fact that flowers could save the world? You know, is it important for us to feel a kind of loss before we get a renewed sense of faith in our journey? Because this works really well in storytelling in general, so do we want to consider that beat in this game? And then how that, again, that goes back to this is the beat, but then how do we tell it? So for example, in Moana, this happens. What happens in our game? What are the tools that we have to actually tell that story? And so I would recommend using references from other stories to talk to the team about why those beats might be important or how that structure will take place.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And I think now we are running out of time, so
Okay.
thanks again,
Thank
Brooke
you.
Maggs, for an excellent lecture.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks.
Okay. And thank you everybody for joining today. I'm Ville Kankainen, and this was Games Now, and join us again on our next lecture. Bye.